The moment Jerome Powell walked into that December 10th press conference, his face told the entire story. Behind his typically measured words and diplomatic responses lay the unmistakable tension of a central banker facing the most divided Federal Reserve in over 6 years, with 3 unprecedented dissents shattering any illusion of unity, just as the most politically charged period in Fed history was about to begin. What we witnessed in that final 2025 press conference wasn't just another routine Fed meeting. It was the visible cracking of America's most powerful economic institution under pressure that would have been unimaginable just a few years ago. Powell's carefully controlled demeanor couldn't hide what insiders are calling the most challenging situation any Fed chair has faced since the 1970s. The numbers alone tell a stunning story of institutional breakdown. For the first time since September 2019, 3 Federal Reserve officials cast dissenting votes on a single decision. Chicago Fed President Austin Goolsbee and Kansas City Fed President Jeffrey Schmid both voted against the rate cut, while Fed Governor Stephen Moran demanded an even more aggressive half-point reduction. But here's the truly shocking part that mainstream media missed. According to Bloomberg's reporting, a much larger group of regional Fed bank presidents who weren't even voting that day also signaled their opposition to Powell's decision. This wasn't just disagreement. This was open rebellion within the Fed's ranks, and Powell's strained expressions during the press conference revealed a man desperately trying to hold together an institution that's fracturing in real time. When asked about the unprecedented dissents, Powell's response, calling it a very challenging situation, barely masked the crisis of authority he's facing as his tenure enters its final months. The deeper crisis becomes clear when you examine what Powell didn't say. Throughout the press conference, his typically confident assertions were replaced by hedged language and careful qualifications. When pressed about future rate cuts, he repeatedly emphasized that the Fed would wait and see, language that signals not prudent caution, but genuine uncertainty about his own committee's direction. The most revealing moment came when Powell admitted, "Everyone around the table at the FOMC agrees that inflation is too high, and we want it to come down, and agrees that the labor market has softened and that there's further risk. Where the difference is how do you weight those risks?" This wasn't the statement of a leader with a clear vision. It was the admission of someone presiding over a fundamentally fractured institution. Behind closed doors, the situation is reportedly even worse than what the public saw. Sources familiar with FOMC deliberations describe an atmosphere of barely contained frustration, with regional Fed presidents openly challenging Powell's leadership and questioning the wisdom of continued rate cuts while inflation remains persistently above target. The December meeting wasn't just contentious. It was described by one participant as the most difficult discussion they'd experienced in years of Fed service. The timing of this institutional breakdown couldn't be worse for Powell personally or the Fed as an institution. With his term as chair expiring in May 2026, Powell faces the impossible task of maintaining credibility while managing a committee that increasingly refuses to follow his lead. The January 21st Supreme Court hearing on Governor Lisa Cook's removal will only add to the political pressure, potentially removing one of his remaining allies on the Board of Governors. Trump's escalating attacks on Powell have clearly taken their toll. The president's recent statement calling Powell a fool and threatening to sue him over Fed headquarters renovation costs represents just the latest in a series of unprecedented political assaults on Fed independence. Powell's refusal to engage with these attacks publicly masks what sources describe as growing frustration and concern about the precedent being set for future Fed chairs. The economic data that should be guiding Fed decisions has become another source of division rather than clarity. The government shutdown's disruption of key economic statistics has left Fed officials literally flying blind on crucial labor market indicators. Powell acknowledged this crisis, stating that upcoming data may be distorted, and not just sort of more volatile, but distorted. How can a central bank make coherent monetary policy when it doesn't have reliable information about the economy it's supposed to manage? This data crisis extends beyond just missing numbers to fundamental questions about the Fed's ability to fulfill its dual mandate of price stability and full employment. With unemployment rising to 4.4% while core inflation remains stubbornly above the 2% target, Fed officials face the impossible task of using a single tool, interest rates, to address two problems moving in opposite directions. The internal Fed dynamics paint a picture of an institution at war with itself. Regional Fed presidents, who have traditionally deferred to Washington leadership, are increasingly asserting independent positions that directly challenge Powell's authority. Kansas City Fed President Jeffrey Schmidt's public dissent wasn't just about monetary policy. It was a direct challenge to Powell's leadership, signaling that regional Fed banks no longer feel obligated to maintain the appearance of unity. The rotation of voting FOMC members in January 2026 will only make Powell's job more difficult. Cleveland Fed President Beth Hammack, who gains voting rights, has already publicly stated her preference for holding rates steady until spring, a direct rejection of Powell's more accommodative approach. With hawks gaining influence just as political pressure for rate cuts intensifies, Powell faces the prospect of even more dissents and public disagreements. Market participants have begun pricing in what traders are calling Fed dysfunction risk, the possibility that internal divisions will paralyze monetary policy decision-making at crucial moments. This isn't theoretical anymore. The December meeting showed that Powell can no longer count on even basic majority support for his preferred policies. The 9-3 vote that emerged was the result of intense private lobbying, not genuine consensus. The communication crisis extends beyond internal disagreements to fundamental questions about the Fed's public messaging. Powell's press conferences, once viewed as masterclasses in central bank communication, have become exercises in damage control. His December performance, characterized by multiple "I don't know" responses and hedged commitments, reflected an institution that has lost confidence in its own analysis and projections. Financial markets are already beginning to lose faith in the Fed's ability to provide stable monetary policy guidance. The persistent elevation in long-term interest rates, despite the Fed's rate cuts, reflects investor skepticism about the central bank's commitment to fighting inflation. When Powell tried to reassure markets that the Fed was well-positioned to handle future challenges, his words carried little conviction. The international implications of Fed dysfunction cannot be overstated. Central banks worldwide rely on Federal Reserve leadership and policy predictability for their own decision-making processes. European central bank officials have privately expressed concern about the reliability of Fed guidance, while emerging market policymakers worry about the potential for erratic U.S. monetary policy to disrupt global financial stability. The mortgage market provides concrete evidence of the Fed's diminished influence. Despite 3 consecutive rate cuts in 2025, mortgage rates remain elevated near 6%, reflecting market skepticism about the Fed's long-term policy direction. Homebuyers and real estate professionals report growing frustration with the disconnect between Fed policy and actual borrowing costs, undermining one of the primary transmission mechanisms of monetary policy. Corporate America is also beginning to question the Fed's reliability as an economic anchor. Business investment decisions that typically depend on predictable interest rate environments are being delayed as executives express uncertainty about the Fed's policy trajectory. This hesitation could become self-fulfilling, contributing to the economic weakness that some Fed officials are trying to prevent. The psychological impact on Powell himself has become increasingly visible to those who work closely with the Fed. Colleagues describe a leader who remains committed to his duties but is clearly struggling with the unprecedented challenges to his authority. The weight of managing both economic policy and political pressure while maintaining institutional credibility is taking a visible toll on someone who has prided himself on calm leadership under pressure. Looking ahead to 2026, every indicator points to escalating rather than resolving tensions. The January Supreme Court hearing will test the fundamental legal framework governing Fed independence, while Trump's expected announcement of Powell's successor will create additional uncertainty about policy continuity. Regional Fed presidents are already positioning themselves for what many expect will be a more fractured and politicized central banking environment. The technical aspects of monetary policy have become secondary to the political dynamics threatening the institution's effectiveness. Powell's desperate attempts to maintain consensus are failing as Fed officials increasingly prioritize their individual economic philosophies over institutional unity. This breakdown represents a fundamental shift away from the collaborative approach that has characterized Federal Reserve decision-making for decades. The most troubling aspect of the current crisis is that it appears to have no clear resolution path. Unlike previous Fed challenges that were primarily economic or technical in nature, the current crisis involves fundamental questions about the institution's independence and authority that cannot be resolved through traditional monetary policy tools. Powell's increasingly strained expressions during public appearances reflect his awareness that conventional solutions are inadequate for the challenges the Fed faces. As we enter 2026, the Federal Reserve stands at a crossroads that will determine not just monetary policy direction, but the very nature of central banking in America. Powell's face during that December press conference told the story of an institution in crisis, led by someone who understands that the choices made in the coming months will either preserve or permanently alter one of America's most important economic institutions. The question is no longer whether the Fed can effectively manage monetary policy. It's whether the institution can survive the political and internal pressures threatening to tear it apart. Powell's expression said it all. This isn't just about interest rates anymore. It's about the survival of central bank independence in American democracy.